Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our second day of the Printing Evolution and Society Conference. Yesterday we were looking at the cost of books and the cost of living. Today we move on to the transmission of texts in print and the distribution and reception of books. I'm Henry Woudhuysen, I'm the Rector of Lincoln College, Oxford, and it has been a great honour as well as a great pleasure to provide something of a home for the 15th century book trade project to Christina and her collaborators. We have 3 papers this morning. All of them will be delivered in English, and I hope there will be some time at the end of the session for some interesting and provocative questions. Our first speaker is Kristian Jensen from the British Library, where he is the acting chief librarian, and normally he is a mere nothing, the head of collections for the whole and curation for the whole of the institution. And he is also the chair of the Consortium of European Research Libraries. He's published extensively on Incunabula, including that indispensable book, Revolution and the Antiquarian Book. And he's going to talk to us today about one of his earlier great projects, which is the 7 years of work that led to the creation of the Bodleian Library's Incunabula Catalogue. Kristian.
Thank you, Henry. And thank you to Christina and her team for inviting me and for this spectacularly splendid event which you have organized for us. Christina asked me to do sort of an oral history of the background to the 15th century book trade project, and especially to the material evidence in Incunabula part of it. So it's a bit like writing my own obituary, but I hope you'll bear with me. In 1992, Claudia Villa published her excellent survey of Horace manuscripts from the 9th to 16th century. She made no mention of 15th century printed books. So for the conference, which in 1994 marked the beginning of the Bodleian Incunabula Catalogue, I invited one of the other outstanding Horace scholars to give a paper on the commentaries of Horace's art of poetry in the Incunabula period. Kristian Jensen delivered an excellent paper focusing mainly on purely textual studies of the commentaries, but he began by summarizing some numbers from Claudia Villa's work. Some 815 manuscripts survive, containing works of Horace ranging from a single poem to the entire corpus. 400 of them are from the 15th century. So just under half from the 15th century. He went on to include a number of editions which contain text by Horace, mentioning 69 editions. But the number of 69 editions, in fact, refers, as we know, to numerous surviving copies. A rough count suggests that the 69 editions, which only contain works by Horace, survive in some 1,640 known copies in public collections. Many more will still be in private hands. Additionally, we now know that there are not 6, as we knew then, but 18 further editions which contain one or more poems of Horace. That's mainly actually the work of the Bodleian Library Incunabula Catalogue that have identified more individual poems. A rough count indicates that these individual or small amounts of poems survive in a total of 1,085 copies. So following Claudia Villa's methodology, counting each individual book, the appropriate number of printed books from the 15th century is not 69, but 2,725 as the minimum. So one should say that 3,540 books from before the 16th century are known to contain works printed by Horace, at that some 3,125 of them are from the 15th century, 2,725 being printed. The topography and the creation of the manuscripts will only make sense fully if seen in the context of their printed contemporaries. Similarly, of course, the intellectual and financial background for the production of the 2,725 printed copies can only be understood if seen in the context of the remarkable increase in the number of manuscripts from the same century. The dramatic change which printing introduced can only be taken into account in Horatian studies if you look at the numbers in a consistent way. Informed by the characteristics of the surviving 15th century manuscripts, a study of printed editions can further give rise to a number of interesting questions specific to printed editions, which can throw light on 15th century Horatian studies, which the study of manuscripts on their own could not have addressed. It took me a few hours to put these figures together for you a few months ago. I didn't have the rough figures available in 1994, but nevertheless, I challenged Professor Kristian Jensen on his approach. He didn't so much disagree with what I said, but he dismissed it because he found it impractical to act on. Dealing with the 15th century printed books was too overwhelming, they were too dispersed, too poorly catalogued, and with too little information to be expected to warrant years of travel around Europe and America. He was adamant that the return for his investment of time wouldn't be worth it. I countered by saying that one shouldn't ignore evidence merely because it was plentiful. And in due course, I responded more fully by publishing an article specifically on Horace editions and certain other classical authors in Leipzig, their relationship with Venetian imports, with contemporary manuscript books, and with teaching practices. But Professor Kristian Jensen was, of course, right. Studying the printed editions of Horace the way he'd studied the manuscripts would not have been sensible. It would also have failed to reveal their specificity. The evidence was there and shouldn't be ignored, but had to be studied using different methods because of the quantity and because that reflects underlying business models and economic realities which differently affect both textual choices and the use of text. My phrase of not ignoring evidence merely because it's plentiful was one of the underlying rationales behind the creation of the Bodleian Library's Incunabula Catalogue, which began in 1992 and had been in preparation a few years before that. And I want here to record my thanks to Lady Bullard and Sir Julian Bullard, who suggested to me that they wanted to help with finding funding for a project with a German angle. It didn't take long to shape the project overall. Actually, it sort of took a weekend. The work itself was a bit longer. Comparing the information available in good catalogues of 15th century printed books with good catalogues of 15th century manuscripts was striking. If you look at the catalogue of printed books, information on the texts and their authors was most often minimal and very often wrong, often based still on identifications made, often for reasons of necessity, by Woudhuysen in the early part of the 19th century. So no blaming him, but perhaps one could have thought of systematically revising some of his identifications earlier. The coexistence in one edition and in one volume of many texts by many authors was often not addressed, and what is now known as paratext were rarely recorded and identified, and if they were, not in a way which enabled scholars to work with them. So for scholars working on medieval textual transmission, catalogues of Incunabula could range from incomprehensible to inadequate or wrong. The growing number of scholars who sought to transcend the two formats often found that the basic bibliographical tools didn't help them much. And clearly people like Claudia Villa and Carsten Friis Jensen were part of that. So I wanted to create a catalogue which would at least make it possible for the printed and the manuscript textual universe to be examined as one corpus. As it surely must have been, and some of the papers yesterday made that clear, it must have been one body of material from the perspective of the 15th century trade and readers. My two main models were the catalogues of Latin manuscripts at the Vatican and the then more recent volumes of the catalogue of medieval manuscripts at the Bavarian State Library. So if you look at the Bodleian Library catalogue of Incunabula and say the Bavarian State Library's manuscripts and see a similarity is not by chance. Completely integral to this was my wish to provide detailed information about each volume as physical objects, full of evidence about their own history. All types of evidence, ranging from full-blown illuminations to marginal doodles, were considered. Of course, the history of ownership was given great prominence, but it was done so as part of a wider documentation of the texts, of the evidence of their use, of each volume as uniquely surviving historical objects, giving equal weight to the earliest history and to the most recent history of the book. There's a strong focus on trade history, institutional history, indeed including down to the price paid for the Bodleian Library when it acquired the material between... Slower? Okay. I find slow difficult, but I'll try. The catalogue, on the other hand, contributes very little new to the analytical bibliographical description of the volumes. Here we drew on the amazing scholarship of the 20th century, summarized, for instance, in the Gesamtkatalog der Wiegendrucker and the British Museum Catalogue of Incunabula, but also many other important incunable catalogues. And we were supported by the impressive catalogue slips prepared by Shepherd, who had collated the Bodleian copies against description found elsewhere. On that background, I felt that we could devote less time to analytical bibliography than would otherwise have been the case earlier in the century. Of course, this approach caused some resistance. One long-retired incunabulist wrote to the Bodleian librarian suggesting we should simply have photographed the manuscript catalogues of Shepherd and published them like that, rather than wasting our times on other things. I wasn't too worried about that. I was much more worried about the criticism of the then keeper of manuscript at the Royal Library in Copenhagen, who thought that publishing in printed form risked immediate oblivion, no matter the quality of the information provided. There were two reasons why we published in printed form. It is now available also as PDFs. One was that it was a requirement made by the funders. The other one was that there was no sustainable library system which could accommodate the data which we created. But it was nevertheless a valid and very worrying criticism. But I had the great fortune to recruit some excellent colleagues to work on the project. Dr. Bettina Wagner joined the team from the outset, bringing her immense experience with medieval textual tradition and her chronological skills, as well as her incredible personal abilities to the project, supplementing her medieval background, supplementing my background as a classicist. When she left, we were joined by Cristina Donde, without whom the project would probably never have been completed, and who also importantly went on to ensure that there was no risk of immediate oblivion. Enter center stage, the 15th century book trade, the ERC-funded project created by Christina. The textual information of the Bodleian now forms the background, Bodleian catalogue now forms the background of text ink element in the 15th century book trade, and the object-specific information of the Bodleian catalogue has largely been incorporated into the material evidence of Incunabula database. The 15th century book trade project has ensured the migration of valuable data generated for the Bodleian catalogue into a sustainable digital environment managed by the Consortium of European Research Libraries. The sustainability is, of course, from my perspective, a very important aspect, and I'm really pleased that that has been achieved. More importantly for us, in the moment, it creates an environment where the data from individual collections can be and is made jointly accessible with that of many others. The tool's not complete, but had Professor Kristian Jensen not died prematurely, very sadly, we might have been able to persuade him to adopt a different methodology to apply his knowledge of the study of Horace and of other classical authors also to printed editions of the 15th century. The effort required would certainly now be repaid by the return of the evidence. drawing on methodologies developed for the study of manuscripts, but projecting it onto material produced by different business models. The material evidence in Incunabula and TextInc will make it so much easier, it already has made it so much easier, for researchers to engage with the dialectic between mechanical multiplication, the physical evidence of individual surviving objects. Longer term, the project aims at providing data at such a scale that it can be used to show trends and patterns well beyond the traditional focus on individual ownership. This should help us to move significantly beyond the rather sterile discussion about the printing revolution. Like many, of course, I find that the notion of revolution is wrong in this context. But for me, it's wrong not because it overemphasizes change. The examples, for instance, around the Horace editions shows that the change was absolutely massive, if not instantaneous. What change is instantaneous? Rather, I think it's wrong because the notion of revolution has a strong connotation of intentionality. Revolutionaries want to change things in a specific direction. They may fail in achieving it, but they have a purpose. Gutenberg and his colleagues, his financial backers and their successors also had a purpose, but they didn't set out to disrupt structures of communication and to create a new world of information. What we do know about them is that they wanted to make money. They wanted to survive, like us, like so many before them and after them. Revolution, for me, completely misunderstands the purpose they were trying to achieve. The interaction between multiplication and individual copy poses questions which may be unique to this period and which can be examined neither with a starting point in revolution nor in continuity. It's exploring this dialectic between multiplication and individuation that we can explore the nature of radical change within its own context of pre-existing business models, user expectations formed by existing patterns of production and use, both amongst users, producers, and distributors. The tension between individual copy and mechanical multiplication can often give us insights into the radical nature of change. Some very good work has been done in this field, especially when it comes to the more expensive end of illumination. We've got Lillian Armstrong with us, who's going to talk later in the conference, who has done fantastic work on understanding not only the art historical, straightforward, aesthetical art historical work of illumination, but also its social and economic context. Much more difficult to visualize is perhaps the change created by small, relatively inexpensive books becoming commercially viable as objects for export. A luxury book produced in Florence could be sold as a luxury object to London, not so strange, but a little grammar book produced in Venice would be sold in southern Germany is completely a new thing. One of the things I have been interested in is how we can use the evidence made more easily accessible and also documented by Christina's project for understanding one of the big changes, which is around the emergence of tiny books as viable objects for commercial exports. I've used this sort of evidence provided by very small format books by studying what it meant to read St. Augustine in the 15th century. They're not mainly by him, but it gives an impression of what people thought they did when they read Augustine. Using provenance information and the context provided of other items in volumes, surviving volumes, not provenance studies relating to individual owners who always, in this case, remained anonymous, but to create an evidence-based contribution to the study of 15th century Augustinianisms. The evidence provided by material evidence in Incunabula, as it grows, will make this type of work a lot easier. I had to, when I did this, I obviously used ISTC. but I also had to use a completely dispersed set of information about surviving Samuel Bender to gather the information. Had May existed for this type of material, a lot of my work would have been done for me, in a sense. Christina has focused the research element of her project on Venice, and that has also been the main focus on the integration of existing information and on the creation of new information within the project itself, and there are obviously very, very good reasons for that. But the tools which have been created by her project are much more wide-ranging, both in reality and in potentiality. They found a long-term home in the service provisions of CERL, where they can be used and are being used for cataloging and sharing provenance information well beyond the Venetian focus. May doesn't provide full coverage, but using it jointly now with location information in ISTC, it can give us some hints at where we can undertake fruitful research in the future. I have myself been particularly interested in the distribution of books from the Rhineland, which in our rather stiff minds isn't seen easily as export because it is within what we now consider as the German area. But of course, the distance between Strasbourg and Lübeck within the German-speaking area is bigger than the distance between Venice and Vienna. So we do need to challenge our own view of what constitutes export. So I've been very interested in the notion of export from the Rhineland, often towards the east. I mentioned that in a short paper I gave at another of Christina's conferences or events in Oxford, and Jerry de la Roca immediately took up the challenge and turned my suggestion of a connection in the far end of the Baltic into something very real, which is also being talked about later on. May gives possibilities for identifying where we don't yet know enough, but where there is scope for knowing more, if you look at it jointly with information, for instance, from ISTC. It also, I think, enables us to be more genre-specific. I think that the patterns of distributions will be increasingly known to be not only about location. We saw very interestingly yesterday about the geographical distribution of sources in Memmingen. I think also it's really important to take genre into consideration. Obviously, missiles haven't got the same distribution patterns as Latin grammars. I long ago showed how the structure of Latin grammar moved, which was traditionally prevalent in Italy, became pan-European in the course of the late part of the 15th, early part of the 16th century, and that it did it in basically two different ways. In southern German speaking lands, the impact can be directly documented by books imported from Italy. Whereas in the rest of Western Europe and Northern Europe, it is documented through textual change to books produced in those parts under impact of probably individually imported books owned by grammar masters who wrote new ones for local consumption. So the impact of import and export articulates itself differently according to where and according to genre. For some of the more expensive books, that pattern obviously would be completely different. And some of the work I've shown, worked on the biblical corpus, shows a very intense pan-European dialectic between commercial needs, local traditions, and instantaneous competition. So again, here we end up with a very uniform textual corpus at the end of the century, from having a much more diverse textual corpus, both called the Bible, in the course of the 15th century. This kind of work can now be done with tools created by Christina and her colleagues. But as I began suggesting, even the most serious scholars of the past have been discouraged from this because the tools for handling the interaction between multiplicity and specificity were not at hand easily. When geographical coverage has been enhanced by owning institutions, by place of production, the type of work which Christina has documented can be done for Venice through her project will also be possible for people working with genres, with places of productions, with places of reception throughout Europe. There is no longer any excuse for ignoring evidence merely because it's plentiful.
Thank you very much, Kristian. That's a very helpful talk in giving us a wider context for the subject of both yesterday's and today's discussions. And it takes us from texts, which he started with the question of the distribution of Horace's works and poems, to the question of distribution and how networks are set up.